Hello and welcome to The Last Word. Was Margaret Thatcher one of the most influential leaders of the last century? And what made her so special? That's the discussion tonight with one of Britain's former cabinet ministers, Andrew Mitchell, the Washington Post correspondent, Simon Denyer, a member of the British House of Lords, Meghnad Desai, and the Telegraph and Times of India columnist, Swapan Das Gupta. Andrew Mitchell, let me start with the question I posed in our introduction. Would you accept that Margaret Thatcher is one of the most influential world leaders of the last century, and even in British terms, arguably she did more to change Britain than even Winston Churchill?
Well, I'd accept absolutely both your two contentions, Karen. I think she did change Britain completely. She came at a very dark time in our economic circumstances. Britain was the sick man of Europe, and she managed to transform that over a decade and more. And also she had a huge influence on the international stage, not just in Europe, but in her particularly good and strong relationship with Ronald Reagan in America, meaning that Britain punched above its weight in international affairs. So she was a remarkable Prime Minister, and we will not see her like again, I think.
And would you also accept, Andrew Mitchell, that in doing all of this, she had to first of all force a change in the thinking of a Tory party that was very reluctant initially to follow where she wanted to lead?
Well, it's true that she had herself said, not long before she became leader of the Conservative Party, that she doubted whether there would be a woman Prime Minister in Britain in her lifetime. So it was a very big change, and quite apart from the cultural change, because of all the economic and other changes she needed to make in Britain, this was a tremendous movement for the Conservative Party as well as for her own country. And she certainly started off with a shadow cabinet where most of the members had not voted for her leadership. And so she was operating in some extents within the Conservative Party in enemy territory. But it was a huge change, and a colossal change too for the Conservative Party.
Lord Desai, her achievements during the 11 years that she was Prime Minister were actually phenomenal. She smashed the unions, she privatized large swathes of British industry, and in the process, she reversed British socialism and restored faith in free market economics, something that the rest of the world then went on to accept as established policy. Would you therefore agree with David Cameron's verdict that she didn't just lead Britain, she saved the country?
I think she transformed the country. There is no doubt. In post-war terms, there's Clement Attlee, who makes Britain socialist, and there's Margaret Thatcher, who desocializes Britain. But also, she was a leading part of a global movement away from a statist arrangement to a much more market-oriented arrangement. She grasped the movement and she led it. So Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, and they anticipated the collapse of the Soviet Union in a remarkable way.
Swapan Das Gupta, starting with Margaret Thatcher's first election victory in '79, the Conservatives ruled Britain for 18 years, and Labour really didn't come back to power until it reformed itself and accepted the Britain Margaret Thatcher had left behind. In fact, in a not-so-tongue-in-cheek remark, Margaret Thatcher once said her greatest achievement was Tony Blair. Would you say that was another measure of her success?
Well, I think, the impact of Margaret Thatcher was best summed up in somewhere I read this morning in one of the British papers, that Thatcher became both a noun and an adjective. There is Thatcherite and there is Thatcherism. Now, I think it's so profound. Most of the impact she had, she was the pioneer of privatization. She was the pioneer of actually rolling back for the first time the frontiers of the state, something which had not been there. The entire corporatist philosophy, the statist philosophy had taken hold.
True.
And most important, I think, in British terms, I think the management of decline had become the British preoccupation post-empire. And Margaret Thatcher tried, perhaps with a mixed degree of success, to arrest that trend, to make Britain competitive all over again.
Okay.
And therefore, her impact, her terms of handling of foreign policy, the grit and determination which she showed, and most important, her status as an outsider who encountered the unrelenting hostility of British academia, British intelligentsia, everybody who counted. And she made a distinction, and there was a distinction between the Tories, who looked down on her with a degree of social disdain and condescension, and a form of radical conservatism which she gave forth. She was truly the conviction politician, and I think her impact is immeasurable.
Simon Denyer, it wasn't just in terms of British domestic politics and more importantly the British economy that she had a huge impact. She also took Britain to new levels of international recognition. She not only forged a close relationship with Ronald Reagan, she was amongst the first international politicians to realize that Gorbachev was a very different sort of Soviet leader. She successfully conducted and decisively won the Falklands War. So even though many were critical at the time and thereafter of her attitude to South Africa and her tolerance of apartheid, would you say nonetheless she restored a lot of the international prestige that Britain had steadily lost since the Second World War?
Well, I think, I lived through Thatcher. I was just coming into my teens when she took power, and, I studied economics at university at Cambridge, where she wasn't uniformly popular. Her theories weren't popular. And I don't disagree with anything that anyone said about her achievements, but I can tell you it wasn't always fun living through the Thatcher years. She was very divisive. I'll come to your point on foreign policy in a second, but she was very divisive, and the Britain she left behind arguably was not a very compassionate Britain. It was a Britain where greed and money was worshipped. And I'm not arguing with the points that other people have made, but I think that the price that Britain paid in terms of high unemployment was also something that can't be ignored. And the decimation of manufacturing in large parts of the north, that's also there. And did she need to take as much shock treatment to the economy as she did? But on the question of foreign policy, yeah, no question. She restored Britain to a central place next to America, but in the end, we all knew that America was boss.
Okay.
And there were times when America didn't do, for example, when it invaded Grenada, it didn't even tell Britain. So there were elements there where America also told us who was boss.
Okay.
In terms of apartheid, I think that was a big issue, and it was something that a lot of people at the time felt very strongly about.
Andrew Mitchell, let's come to Margaret Thatcher's personality. She once famously said that she was a conviction politician, not a consensus politician. In fact, she also virtually looked upon consensus as if it was a dirty word. How critical to her character was that particular individual approach to politics?
Well, it was absolutely essential because, as your other contributors have said, she was about reversing a lack of self-confidence and a national decline which had taken root after the Second World War and had continued ceaselessly since then. There was a feeling that governing Britain was about managing that post-imperial decline. And you needed to have her strength of character and her conviction if you were to confront this and change it. And, the term conviction politics is one that is absolutely associated with her. And your last contributor was making the point about some of the social difficulties which her transformation of the British economy engendered. The fact was that these were very difficult endemic problems in Britain, and it was her strength of character and her conviction which ensured that we confronted them and defeated them. And, I was a candidate in 1983 in the northeast of England, and I remember the huge importance that was attached to Nissan setting up their giant car manufacturing plant, absolutely critical to the rejuvenation of a part of the country that had seen the shipyards and the coal pits closing. And that was brought in as a result of the change to the British economy, the attraction to inward investment that Mrs. Thatcher had presided over.
Lord Desai, she was born the daughter of a Grantham grocer, and she laid a lot of stress on what she called Victorian values: hard work, personal responsibility, the rights of the individual as opposed to the rights of society. In fact, she once said that there was no such thing as society. Was that another critical aspect of her political personality?
Yes, I know. What was she actually saying in that famous quotation? Is that quite a lot of the people at that time were saying, so-and-so is a criminal, but that's not his fault. It's society which has made him a criminal, or poverty is society. So she was saying, hang on, let's first of all say, if individual does something, that is the individual's responsibility. Society may be there, but primarily it's your behavior and you have to account for it. That was a very strong part of her belief. And I think eventually she won the day on that, while we recognize this thing. But another thing I want to say importantly, she may have been a convention politician, but she won 3 elections.
Absolutely.
And you only do it by convincing people that the pain you are inflicting is in their interest.
And she convinced people brilliantly that she was determined and she was resolute and she wasn't going to win. Do you remember that famous phrase, the lady's not for turning?
At one stage, more unemployed were voting Conservative than Labour. I remember that it was very painful for the Labour Party. Trade union members were voting Thatcher. Unemployed were voting Thatcher. And we were losing.
Sapna Dasgupta, the other quality she had was that she was virtually indefatigable. She worked long hours, she slept very little, and she loved a thoroughly good fight. Would you accept the verdict that hers was not just a decisive personality, but also a divisive one, and she either repelled people or found admirers in plenty, but no one was left indifferent by her?
Well, that's true. You know, it's always been said she was a very polarizing figure, that you either loved her or you loathed her. And I think some of the reactions which have happened in Britain since the news of her death came through are symptomatic of that. There have been rather disgraceful demonstrations of people actually celebrating with champagne, while there's been a sense of dejection and mourning and a sense of loss for a lot of others. But I think what's really, to my mind, important about this thing about Thatcher as a divisive figure, a polarizing figure, is that she was never afraid of taking up unpopular causes.
Absolutely.
You know, she could go against the grain of popular wisdom. Now, you recall the time, I think it was in the early 80s, when those loads of economists, including people like Amartya Sen, etc., signed up. I don't know if Meghnad was part of that lot, who signed up and said, here, this attempt to cut the deficit was actually, self-defeating. But the point is, those deficit targets were met. Inflation was brought down. Again, on the question of Europe, she had the foresight to actually say no to an increasingly bureaucratized, the growing federalization of Europe. Of course, she got it wrong. She got it wrong, horribly wrong on the question of Germany. She got it wrong on South Africa. But overall, I think here was a person, which we should remember, is that who recognized that the times were such that you couldn't afford to have a namby-pamby consensus any longer.
Absolutely.
That had been attempted and failed. You had to take a position.
Simon Denyer, unfortunately, her prime ministership after 11.5 years ended abruptly, and some would say very cruelly, when she was virtually ousted from office in November 1990. Most people remember it as a revolt against the hated poll tax. Did she, in her passion for reform, take reform one step beyond what either her party or her country would accept?
I think she probably did, and I think, I think also that what she did also was cut her rivals down to size. By the time she left, there really wasn't very much left of the Tory cabinet with much personality, and we ended up with John Major as Prime Minister, which no one really can thank her for. So, there was an element there where perhaps she had her time, and it was time for her to go and to move on, and for other people to find something from her legacy which perhaps was, you know, not rejecting her emphasis on privatization, her position on the state, but being more compassionate about it.
Let's take a break at that point, gentlemen. When we come back, we're going to ask, how then will history remember Margaret Thatcher? That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to The Last Word. We're discussing Margaret Thatcher, one of the world's great leaders who passed away in London yesterday. Andrew Mitchell, 23 years after her prime ministership, most people today remember Mrs. Thatcher because of the film The Iron Lady. Was it a fair portrayal? And was it wrong to portray her dementia?
Well, I think people are very divided on that. I know many of her close friends and admirers who thought it was a good film, and I know others who don't. For me, I thought it was premature. I thought it was too soon. It was a film more about old age and dementia than about Lady Thatcher. So I thought that it should have been made, you know, after she had passed on. But, you know, many people who rate her and love her very much thought that it was a good film and made a huge contribution to the discussion of old age.
And very quickly, as someone who knew her, did it capture the essence of the person as you remember her?
Well, it didn't capture the essence of the person I knew, because I had known her when I was first a Member of Parliament, and she was at the height of her powers. And this was a film about someone who was in steady but remorseless decline. So it didn't capture the Lady Thatcher that I particularly remembered. But, you know, when I was a young MP and she appeared either in the House of Commons tea room or in the corridors, you know, she was a figure of enormous power and authority. And for a young man like me, I just used to stand to attention and hope that she would pass by, or that she wouldn't ask me some question about the latest money supply figures.
Simon Denyer, the one thing that did come through in that film was how close her relationship was with her husband Dennis, and what an incredible support he'd been in her early years as an MP, and even in her early years as a minister. Has he got the recognition he deserves for his role in the making of Margaret Thatcher?
No, I don't think so. I think Dennis was always a bit of a figure of fun in Britain, you know, have a gin and tonic and not be much use. That's what most people thought about Dennis Thatcher. But there's no doubt that from her words, he was a huge support to her, and she mentioned that in many interviews, and that was very, very, very apparent. And I think even when she was starting to lose her memory, she very sort of, her daughter Carol was sort of rather moving. You had to remind her several times that Dennis had actually passed away, and she would be upset by it each time. So yes, I mean, I think Dennis was a bit of a figure of fun, but perhaps unkindly so. But you know, there was a lot of comedy, and there was a lot of mickey taking of Mrs. Thatcher. It actually bred a good era of British comic talent and satire at the time, because the place was so divided. So
Absolutely.
Some of us, you know, laughed at the time in that era.
Lord Desai, surprisingly for many people, she forged a close relationship and friendship with Indira Gandhi, and thereafter always had a soft spot for Rajiv Gandhi. No doubt Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher were iron ladies in a male-dominated world, but they came from very different social and cultural backgrounds. Were you surprised by that friendship?
I think I was. Mind you, they're both from Oxford, so, you know, this Oxford connection is there. But I'm surprised because, you know, it says Margaret Thatcher, whatever she did, was a constitutionalist. She never broke the constitution.
Whereas Indira Gandhi was not.
Indira Gandhi did.
Swapan Dasgupta, a very quick last word from you. I want to end by echoing a thought from today's Financial Times. The paper says Thatcher wrought a revolution whose fundamentals are entrenched as the common sense of our age. Would you accept that as a fitting verdict for her today? A quick answer, please.
I would certainly, but I would go further and say she's like a good Gros Cru wine. At the time, when it was young, when the idea was young, taste was indifferent. But as the years go by, I think they will be really fascinating and something which we all look forward to and will leave a very pleasant taste in the mouth.
Andrew Mitchell, Simon Denyer, Lord Meknad Desai, and Swapna Das Gupta, thank you very much for joining me. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.